afternoon and good evening to our audience in Iraq and in Europe. My name is Abbas Kadem. I am the director of the Iraqi initiative at the Atlantic Council. Welcome to our today's event, assessing the impact of Iraq's incoming government. This is an on-record event. You are welcome to tweet what you like from what you will hear here at the hashtag #ACIraq. And it is an honor to have an excellent panel with us. Ambassador Faisal Astarabadi. He is the founding director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East. And Dr. Sajjad Chiad. He is a fellow at the Century Foundation, and Dr. Marcin Shimmery, research fellow at the Middle East Initiative, Harvard Kennedy School. Ambassador Faisal Astarabadi is also a member of the Iraqi Initiative's Advisory Committee. His upcoming book is Prosecuting Tyrants in Iraq. Dr. Marcin Shimmery, joining us from Iraq. She recently released an excellent study, Iraqi Elections, Independence, and New Political Parties. And Dr. Sajjad Chiad, who is also joining us from Iraq. He is currently directing a Shia working group or a working group on Shia politics. This is anticipated to have a book released or finished by the end of this year. So to start, I would like to ask Ambassador Faisal Astarabadi to walk us through the intricacies of the formation of government from a constitutional point of view. Dr. Faisal Astarabadi was one of the founders of the Iraqi constitutional framework in the post-2003 era. He took a leading role in drafting the transitional administrative law. Much of his vision and his ideas were adopted later from that document into the permanent Iraqi constitution, which he always insists that he took no part of, and so he doesn't get any blame for that, and that's rightfully so. So I would like you, Ambassador, to tell us about the glitches and also the challenges that the constitutional framework, the pertinent articles in the constitution that relate to the formation of the government, and how they hinder the smooth formation of government every time we've had to witness a government being formed in Baghdad. We are now looking at the fifth attempt at forming a government. Welcome to the Atlantic Council, to this event, and thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kadem. It is a real pleasure to be with you and with my colleagues. I am particularly pleased. I cannot remember another panel that consisted entirely of Iraqis that I've participated in. And I have to say, you are one of the few people that can pull that off. And I've seen any number of panels in Washington discussing Iraq with absolutely no Iraqi voice. I'm delighted that you have arranged for a panel that represents diverse Iraqi voices, and I'm privileged to be one of them. As far as the Constitution is concerned, I always say the permanent Constitution incorporated all the mistakes I made in the transitional administrative law and none of the good things I did. So we ended up with a necessity in I think one of the fundamental flaws, to respond to your question, one of the fundamental flaws of the Iraqi constitution is that all constitutional offices, the term of all constitutional offices expire at the same time. So the president, the prime minister, and the Speaker of Parliament. Now, the Prime Minister and the Speaker of Parliament, both sort of being creatures of Parliament, although there's no actual requirement that either one of them be elected to Parliament. This was actually one of the mistakes I made in the TAL. But all three terms expire at the same time, so that there is really a period of vacuum from the time of the elections until a government is finally formed. There's a real period of vacuum, and the Constitution doesn't address that vacuum. What are the rights and obligations of the outgoing Prime Minister of Iraq now? Does he lead a caretaker government, or can he undertake actions that will go beyond his really expired term? The Constitution is silent on this. Members of Parliament from time to time in prior administrations, prior governments, have pointed out that after the election, the Prime Minister is a caretaker. Nur al-Maliki, as he was trying to contest for a third term, took the position that no, he was the Prime Minister until there was another Prime Minister sworn in, and he had the full panoply of powers. And I must say, not that I would have, not that I supported Maliki getting another term, but there is in fact nothing in the Constitution that limits the powers of the Prime Minister, and I have to say, and the government, and I have to say, I think that's a flaw. We need continuity. I think we need to have the president, for instance, stagger the term so that there's no doubt about the presidency, but we don't do that. It's up for grabs every single time. And so now we have an outgoing president, an outgoing prime minister, an outgoing cabinet of sort of a precarious position. The position of speaker has been settled. There was a court challenge on the speakership of parliament, and that constitutionally always has to be the first step. A speaker has to be elected. That has occurred. His election was challenged. The Supreme Federal Court heard the challenge and upheld his Halbusi's election. We had, of course, a designation of a president, and that also went to the Supreme Federal Court. I have to admit, much to my surprise, the Supreme Federal Court ruled that the candidate, the former foreign minister, former finance minister of Iraq, Hoshyar Zebari, was not qualified to hold the position of president because of Article 63 of the Constitution. Specifically, although the court didn't specify, I think it's sub-Article 3 of Article 63, which has to do with good reputation, known for integrity, uprightness, and loyalty to the homeland. The Hoshyar Zebari was removed by Parliament from the last position he held in the federal government, which was that of finance minister, because of accusations of irregularities in respect to state finances when he was foreign minister. And those charges have never been removed. Of course, famously in 2017, Hoshyar Zebari also became a very public advocate for the independence of the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So potentially that part of subpart 3 of Article 63 was implicated. That plus the recent, and I'll try to wrap up with this and one more thought, that plus the recent decision also by the Supreme Federal Court on the contracts, the oil contracts that the Kurdistan regional government has signed with oil companies, suggests to me that the Supreme Federal Court is going to play a real role in the upcoming period going forward, and that it is not merely going to be a rubber stamp for the powers that be, as it became, unfortunately, under the prime ministership of Nouri al-Maliki. So we will see how this develops. It's an interesting development. We'll see how it develops. Other than the election of the Speaker of the House, we are no closer to the election of a prime minister and a cabinet than we have been since the election of Speaker Halbousi. What must occur now is that a nomination of a president must be made. He will, presumably it could be a woman, of course, unlikely given Iraq's politics. The nominee will have to receive either a 2/3 vote on the first ballot or a simple majority on subsequent ballots. And then the prime minister, in consultation with the leadership of the parties, will designate a prime minister who must also acquire the confidence of parliament and appoint a government, each one of whom must acquire the confidence of parliament. That's a rough, I hope not too long, overview of the constitutional process.
Well, thank you very much. And I will come back and ask you a few questions about this rich introduction of the process itself and the constitutionality frame for it. By the way, also our audience are welcome to post questions using the question and answer section of your Zoom screen, and type your questions. They all come to me, and I will try to allow as much time as possible for the audience questions, and we look forward to your questions as well. Thanking you for your time and for following us and for attending this timely conversation. Let me move to Dr. Marcin El-Shammari. Dr. Marcin, this elections, as just Ambassador Astarabadi mentioned, it is the first. It is not an ordinary election. It is a first time we had an early election, a snap election in Iraq, and it came after the resignation of the government of Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi after just over a year of its assuming office. Protests erupted in Baghdad on October 10, 2019, and then there was a cascade of events, both domestic and international, that gave Iraq an extraordinarily hard time. And then we went through, again, to build on what the ambassador just mentioned and how hard it is to form a government. We went through 3 attempts to replace Prime Minister Abdel Mahdi until finally Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi was gained the confidence of the Council of Representatives and took office early May of 2020. Now, the protest movement that brought in all of these events, the early elections, of course, before that, the resignation of the government, and then they were instrumental in in following up and influencing the formation of the government in the 3 iterations that I just mentioned. They are not as present now. They are not on the streets, and they were in the formation of the government between 2019 and 2020. They were there, and they showed their opinion, and also by either rejecting or favoring certain candidates. They are not there on the streets or in Tahrir Square. They are also not present in the parliament through their representatives. There are people who were elected by the protest movement, or they were elected because they were close to the protest movement. They gained a good number. Actually, many people did not even expect they would gain that number of seats. But once they took office in parliament, they either split. There were some inner disputes among them. There was a major dispute that caused some people to exit from the group after the vote by some of them for Speaker Halbousi. Where are they now? And is it normal to see this absence of their voice while the government is being formed and there is a high-level debate in Iraq? Or is it too early for them to weigh in, and we expect their voice to be heard loud and clear when it comes to time comes to selecting a prime minister and forming a cabinet, because that's what they were protesting in the first place, and that's what they were influencing or trying to influence in 2019, 2020.
Thank you, Dr. Kalam. This is an excellent question. And I want to thank the Atlantic Council for convening this gathering today as well, because I mean, for the last few months, everyone's mind has been on government formation, and this is the conversation we'll be having for probably the next few months as well, by the rate of what's happening so far. To answer your question, I think I'd like to, first of all, start by saying that when we talk about protesters and when we talk about their presence in politics, be it in parliament or on the streets, we're really talking about two groups of people that sometimes overlap and sometimes they don't. And that's the protest-based parties. And this includes the parties that did end up in parliament, like Imtidad, as well as the ones who didn't, as well as just the everyday protester or the people who made up the squares, and really analyzing the behavior of both sets who are, who talk to each other and who have some correspondence, but who may have different views and who have some opposition, as naturally with large groups usually happens. But my hypotheses for why we're not seeing the protesters in particular in the streets right now run along several lines, but I actually think it's perfectly normal and something that we could have expected. If we think back to the government formation process that brought Prime Minister Kadhimi, at that time, it was really because of the protest movements. People had brought down a prime minister and wanted a new one. And so for the first time really in Iraq's history, we can see actual voting with your feet, where they could put up a poster of someone who they didn't like and put an X on it and really put an end to their run. And we saw this with Mohammed Tawfiq Alawi in particular, when people didn't like that he had held a cabinet position before. So this is a different instance for them. This isn't the direct aftermath of a protest movement. This is the result of getting a new electoral law and going through an entire process in which people who had participated in the protest did show up in parliament, ultimately through Imtidad as one avenue, but also as independents. And I think this also explains why we see less of the voice of the public in protesting or in even making certain views about the government formation process loud right now. It's because we have Imtidad that doesn't claim to be a representative of the protest movement in its entirety, but it does have clear ties to them. And you can see even in its rhetoric and in the way it presents itself that it wants to be the voice of the protest movement in some capacity. And so we saw this when they rode the tuk-tuk to parliament, and with their frequent photos and how their messaging is shaped. And so because we have a protest-based party in parliament, people are waiting to see, how will this party behave? Will this party be an avenue for reform, or will it be, sucked into the chaos that is government formation and later politics in Iraq? And so I think a lot of the people who had protested, particularly the ones with a reformist agenda, are holding a wait and see approach. I know, for example, that some of the parties that had decided to boycott and not to run have a bit of regret for not having participated, having seen the relative success of Imtidad. And so that's generally a second reason for why we don't really see a lot of action around protesting certain figures for certain positions or not. And keeping in mind that protests in Iraq, when they came in the past, were usually, if they weren't around election time, they were basically based on grievances, economic grievances, asking for jobs. And Tishrin was a bit of an exception in that it was an umbrella protest for so many things. But right now, the limited protests that we see are very small. They're not, mass movements. The one that comes to mind is Hoshar Zebari, the protest against his presidency or his candidacy. And that was based on reasons of him being not a figure of Iraqi unity, but that was very small. And some of these protest movements are motivated by political parties, so they don't really represent anything. I'd also like to say that I see that the Iraqi public generally gives a grace period, for a hopeful grace period, during every time we go through government formation or we get a new prime minister. There's a small wait and see approach that's employed by the public. And then if you fall into the same pattern, then you're more likely to get protests. And I do think that, for example, Mustafa al-Kadhimi became prime minister, he got a grace period from the public that didn't immediately boycott him. And, we really haven't hit the prime minister phase in government formation right now. And if you think about it, most of the protesters we had seen who had protested against candidates or against certain politicians tended to be from the South. So they tend to be Shia Arabs. And I think they'd be more invested at this point in protesting a candidate from the premiership that they really thought was a terrible candidate. And we haven't hit that point. So we still do have to wait and see if they will do something similar to what they did with Mohammed Tawfiq Alawi, where they rejected his candidacy. So I do think we might get something small scale protesting a particular individual, but I don't see it being something anywhere large scale. At this point, I think government formation will just proceed as usual, and protests will come later if they fail to deliver.
Thank you, Doctor. And I must also mention that last time, the only position that was considered for replacement was the Prime Minister. So we cannot really compare building on what you just said, and I agree with you, we cannot compare what the protesters' position would have been based on the 2019-2020, because the president and the speaker were not on the replacement list. It was immediately just to replace a government for a government, a cabinet for a cabinet, and also a prime minister for a prime minister. So that's why my question was, are we going to? So you seem to see that probably when we come to the phase of prime minister's selection, we would see more, support or veto process at a scale that remains to be seen. So thank you for that point. I appreciate it. Dr. Sajjad, let me ask you. Of course, I will come back to the whole panel about the domestic configuration of Iraqi interests, but I would like you to also walk us through the positions of regional actors and also other stakeholders or interested parties from beyond the region, the United States, the UK, other European Union, also the UN, which has not been vocal until now on many of the recent, at least last 10 days, 2 weeks developments in Iraq. We did not hear or see the visibility of the presence of the UNAMI there. So how are we to assess the positions of the most interested parties in the region here? Of course, Iran always comes in the conversation, and Iran unusually held until the last minute, and then they weighed in by sending General Ismail Qa'ani after a period of silence. And then we saw a very noticeable activity in the last couple of weeks, or even more, 3 weeks or so. The UAE has been involved from the beginning in encouraging some of the politicians that they have good relations with to come together and work. Turkey also hosted both leaders of the Arab Sunni political blocs and tried to bring their positions closer to one another. Those efforts, it is said that led to the unity among the Sunni political blocs. And so among those countries, how do you see the dynamics of the international involvement? And if we can just use as a point of reference your experience being close or in Baghdad in previous government formations. Is it different this time? Do we expect a different outcome? Who would be the quote unquote winners or losers in their competition to seeing their friends or their close friends in power in Baghdad?
Thank you. Very interesting listening to Ambassador Starabadi and Dr. Marcin's comments. I think the trend that I can see from being here in Baghdad all these past years during government formation is that Iraqi agency seems to be a little bit on the increase. That's what I can see. Before, 2006, 10 and even in 14, it sort of all depended on what the US wanted or what Iran wanted. And, could they get to an agreement? Could they sort of settle on a person that they wanted as prime minister or speaker? That has started to change, I think, 2018 and onwards. The trend has been more that the Iraqi agency is increasing. Of course, accompanying that is a couple of other sort of issues. The first is the divisions and splits within each party have grown. So, whether it's a Kurdish party or a Sunni Arab party or a Shia party, the divisions within each wing or within each party have started to sort of break down their strategic engagements with other groups, with other blocs. The splits within Fatah, for example, splits within, the PUK is well known and others. And that's complicated the political scene. And the lack of statesmen in Iraq, which means parties then go looking for a sponsor or looking for an outside partner because they have so much distrust for both their fellow politicians in their own party, but also for those from other blocs, rivals and opponents. And this causes, obviously, the international powers, the other countries to get more involved because essentially they are being sought as, mediators, as sponsors, as backers of one party versus the other, and it causes sort of Iraqi agency in some way to decrease. So that sort of the dichotomy we have, or the clash between these two bits, the increase in Iraqi agency, but the increase in distrust among parties and politicians is accompanying each other. I think that's something important to note. In addition, I think the experience that we had with former Prime Minister Maliki, the fact that he became quite powerful and he used his power to weaken his opponents, to go after them militarily, to use his position as Prime Minister to try to sideline and marginalize others. There is a lot of fear right now that the same scenario could be repeated if, for example, Muqtada Sadr becomes the new sort of power behind the throne, or if one party sort of begins to dominate politics, then they could use sort of a similar set of powers as before to try to marginalize the others, but also to go after them in a sort of security sense, not just to weaken them politically, but to chase them and out on the streets, as they say. And I think that fear is probably one of the reasons why we've seen a lot of blockages in the political scene. In terms of winners and losers, I don't think it's possible to have an outright winner in Iraqi politics. I don't think we have anything apart from consensus and compromise. That's always what ends up happening. Of course, you mentioned Iran and the US and Turkey and UAE and Qatar. These are the five powers recently that have been involved on a mass scale in terms of their engagements, in terms of trying to reach a desirable outcome. But while some of these countries may see it as being zero-sum, I don't think it is zero-sum, obviously. And I don't think that it is possible for one winner to emerge. I think what we will have to have is a compromise, because it's not possible to back one party or one group or one politician and expect that everybody else will sort of lose out. It's just not possible. Why? Because the winners and losers both have seats, influence, cabinet positions, weapons, armed wings, foreign sponsors, bases, whatever you want to call it. They have all of these elements, winners and losers. Therefore, it's not sort of possible to dominate, politics while these elements exist. The people in power and in opposition, if we can use that term, are essentially the same sort of power, the same capabilities. Of course, I think the US is very keen on making sure that the next Iraqi government is friendly to the US, is certainly sort of more distant from Iran, as former Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi was, for example, and is very keen to ensure that their interests in Iraq are not threatened. Someone who, the next prime minister, the next government will take a firmer line on security, will sort of stop all these attacks on US interests inside the country, and will at least try to impose as much of rule of law as possible. They believe that the sort of previous Iraqi governments have been too weak in this respect. For Iran, obviously, their concern is that the next government is too US friendly and then comes after Iranian interests and weakens Iran's hand. And so you can see these two countries are sort of on one side competing against the other. Turkey obviously is concerned about its interests and again wants to ensure that the next government is formed is as pro-Turkey as possible, given the situation that we have in Sinjar and the Kurdistan region, access to water resources and so on. For the UAE and Qatar, I don't think they're impacted directly by what happens in Iraq. But obviously for the UAE, they're trying to sort of expand their foreign policy capabilities. For Qatar as well, their ability to influence events in the rest of the Arab world is important to them. And so, we have politicians and parties going to seek Qatar and Turkey and UAE in terms of asking for their support. I don't think that will stop, no matter what happens with the next government. I think this will continue. But for now, I don't think any one side has sort of got the upper hand. Certainly, there is an idea that the Sadrists have become sort of more powerful because the US is backing the Sadrists against Iran. That is the sort of the common logic, and there is probably some truth to that. But I don't think that the Sadrist or Muqtada Sadr himself is pro-US. The history he has and his position of moving from one side to the other, and I think it's just a matter of him being sort of the ultimate sort of Machiavellian politician at the moment. He wants to maximize gains for himself, to protect his party. And for the US, it's a convenience that he, at the moment, has got a disagreement with the Iranians on the way forward. But I think whatever happens, they will have to come to a compromise. I cannot see one side completely dominating against the others, despite the wishes of these foreign powers.
Thank you. I fully agree. And from that, let me ask a question to the whole panel. And in this case, going to the other side of the equation, which is the Iraqi political blocs. As we all know and probably agree that Iraqis do not, as I always say, do not elect a president. They do not elect a prime minister. They do not elect even a ruling party or a ruling bloc. They elect negotiators. Once the elections are done, the results are tallied and certified, then there will be from each group of the winning blocs will send their own negotiating teams, and often or probably even always, we could dare say that the results and the positions that are coming out of the elections and that are assigned or allocated to these groups don't look like the results of the elections in terms of majorities and minorities, and they don't even look like the constitution. Problem of it is that what has happened as those consociational or those side agreements that are made as a result of those negotiations have sunk in and became traditions, so much so that you see people speak about them and they claim that they are in the constitution. Yesterday, I was watching one of those programs with an Iraqi who was presenting himself as an opposition, a leading opposition figure, and he spoke about this idea of distributing the top positions among the three major groups as this is what the constitution has, and he was asking to change the constitution to abolish this idea that a president will be a Kurd and the speaker will be a Sunni and the prime minister will be a Shia, and we all know that it is not in the constitution. It is always the tradition that was set. So if we were just to keep that in mind and look at the new political map right now, there have been changes in the in the political map and among the major groups, at least. It's a welcoming moment and a welcome development that the Sunni Arabs have managed to create a coherence among themselves, and they are now more invested in the federal government and in their role than before. And this started actually with the 2018 elections as well. They were more interested in participation than their apathy in the past that led to the disasters in their provinces. But now they are probably in the best position. Meanwhile, the Kurds, who always left their differences back in the Kurdistan regional government and also in the Iraqi Kurdistan region, and went to Baghdad united, asking for common interest and common agenda. They can't be far apart now from one another between Soleimani and Erbil, and especially with the moment of weakness and division and divisiveness, quite frankly, that is happening among the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, but also the rise of other forces in Kurdistan now that they are carving out seats from both parties, but mostly from the PUK side. They are, I think, in light of this battle over the presidency, and also what happened with the Supreme Court decisions, both as related to government formation and for recent one on the oil issue, probably we will not see a rapprochement between the two parties for the next 4 years if the same zero-sum game continues. And the Shia now is, again, with the way they are having their politics and this divided politics that they have, they are, although they were always competitors with one another, and they tried, each group of them wanted to get the prime ministership, but there was some form of united voice in the past. Now it is a zero-sum game also among the Shia, or among two major blocks of the Shia. So how are we going to see this going forward? First of all, what will it do to our prospects of seeing a good, strong, and also stable government that will govern for the next 4 years and get an agenda done, not a political agenda or a party or a sectarian ethnic agenda, but more of an economic agenda, an agenda to really restore the trust between the political elite, between the political regime and the Iraqi people. And if we end up really having a government that would be also a compromise government, or is there any chance that you see anywhere that we can't see here that basically can bring a possibility of a government that has a strong backing in the Council of Representatives? Where are we going with this continuously shifting political map among all Iraqi blocs from all ethno-sectarian backgrounds? And this is to the whole panel. Feel free to comment on any side of the Iraqi politics, or on all the aspects of the political dispute. And let me start then, of course, with Ambassador Astarabadi on the question of this division that we are seeing, and how they are going to try to reconcile their differences. What are the best ways for them to put these aside and work together for getting a government at least done, which is the constitutional mandate on all of them?
Thank you. I normally jump in. I didn't this time because I'm well aware that my two distinguished panelists are sitting in Baghdad and I'm not, and that they should have sort of priority. But I'll try to wrap up very quickly on this question. Allow me first to say that I really was struck by something. I mean, I was struck by everything my colleagues said, but in particular, I wanted to underscore something that Dr. Sajjad mentioned, which is that there's a lack of statesmanship in Iraq, and that really hit home because it seems to me in the post-2003 period, there were two statesmen in Iraq. I worked for one of them, Dr. Adnan Pachachi, the other was Jalal Talabani, and they're both gone. And so we are left with what we are left with. This underscores my point. I am not comparing Dr. Barham Saleh to either Dr. Pachachi or to Mr. Talabani. You cannot mention him with them. But if his term were not up, and if he were not one of the people who at least wishes to continue in the presidency, were he not, at least in his own mind, a contender for it would be a different state of affairs. So this is a structural problem, a constitutional problem that drives us towards more divisive politics, because everything is up for grabs every time we have an election. One of the reasons that, as difficult as it was, as you pointed out, Dr. Kadhim, when the prime minister resigned, before we had early elections, one of the reasons it was easier, not easy, but easier to replace the prime minister was because neither the speaker nor the presidency was up, as you said. Now, that said, my fear in what you said and what you took to be optimistic about the sort of the Sunni bloc, my fear isn't, I agree with you that it is salutary that they are engaged in the politics of Iraq, which they largely gave up on in 2010 after Ayad Allawi was not called to seek to form a government. And no change occurred, even though they voted for Allawi and he got a plurality of the seats. More seats, I should say, than the Sadrist bloc has won now, even though the media has filled us with accounts of how the Sadrists won the Iraqi election. They got 73 seats this time, plus or minus. Of course, you have to have a working majority around 163, I think it is, or 65 to get to 50% plus one in parliament. My fear for the Sunnis is that they've fundamentally given up on Baghdad, not in the sense of returning us to 2014, but that it just doesn't matter. So they're going to be inward looking in Anbar, in Nainawa, in Diyala, but not really engaged in Baghdad because they're not going to be president again. They're not going to capture the prime ministership. So I'm not sure that's really something to be optimistic about. It's better, to paraphrase Lyndon Baines Johnson without giving the entire quote, it's better that they're inside the tent. But I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as you are. Fundamentally, there is a splintering of the parties. You mentioned the Kurds historically in the post-2003 dispensation. The KDP has largely let the PUK have sort of pride of place in Baghdad while maintaining pride of place in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. The KDP now seems to be challenging that, a sort of understanding, gentleman's understanding. What does that mean for the PUK in Erbil if the KDP gets the presidency? Can we see a revival of the movement which was afoot some years ago for the possibility of the KRG splitting into two different regions? There had been a move for this some years ago that was papered over. So the fracturing of Iraqi politics seems to me, and again, I'm not sitting in Baghdad as my colleagues are, the fracturing of Iraqi politics seems to me a much more likely possibility than a cohesive government that can truly govern. The issue that confronts Iraq now is the economics. The state of Iraq is fundamentally, in my view, non-sustainable economically. As a sort of a single cash crop, so to speak, single resource. 97% of our income comes from oil. That is simply not going to be sustainable. But on the other hand, the price of oil has crept up of late. And so the pressure on the political class to deal with the price of oil, to deal with oil as the only sort of resource that Iraq has, the only economic resource, is now less than it was, say, a year ago. And the political class in Iraq tends to deal with crises and not long-term planning. My fear is that we're going to see more of the same in the post-2003 dispensation, which is the politics of consensus, which is also the politics of sort of stagnation and being frozen in place. That's my fear.
Sajjad, let me ask you to build on what you just said in your introductory remarks. With Sayyid Muqtada Sadr's slogan that is being sort of firmly held up to this moment, لا شرقية ولا غربية, حكومة أغلبية وطنية. So it's not Eastern, not Western, but a government of a national majority. Now, looking at this from where you ended and extrapolating it on Iraqi politics, is it one of the reasons that is holding this smooth government formation, or at least alliance making? Because that means basically that that Sayyid Muqtada started initially with overtly trying to exclude some of the people he thought they are very close to, either to the east or to the west, and mostly the east. In fact, is what his emphasis was. Is it that, or is there another dynamic going on this time that is making us holding even the constitutional timeline was not observed this time? And probably I will go back later to Ambassador Esterabadi to ask him about that new interpretation of the 30-day and all of these numbers that are put in the constitution, and how the political elite is massaging the language for that. But basically, is it that? Is it the position of Sadr, or is there another dynamic that goes beyond the Shia and it goes all around, that is making this time the transition not that smooth?
It's a good question. I think that dynamic is there, and there's a second dynamic. I'll mention the second dynamic first. There were three decisive political battles that were won. The KDP defeated the PUK and has the right now to say that we are the political representatives of the Kurds in Baghdad. We will no longer allow the PUK to choose the president of Iraq, because we have won the battle for political representation in Kurdistan region and for Kurds in all of Iraq. Therefore, why should we accept having a minority sort of power be the one choosing the president when we have much more seats than they do? So that has complicated the situation. The second is obviously Halbusi's win, in outside his heartlands. In Diyala picked up seats, in Salah ad-Din, in Nainawa, convincing defeat in a way for the Sunni Islamists, but also Khanjar's Azim alliance struggled really to compete against Halbusi. And so Halbusi has the right also then to call the shots, at least among the positions and posts reserved for the Sunni Arab parties. And likewise, Muqtada Sadr convincingly defeated Fatah and the parties and groups aligned with Fatah, picked up 3-4 times the number of seats that they did. The fourth battle is the one that has complicated things. The fact that Maliki was able to convincingly defeat Ammar al-Hakim and Haider al-Abadi as the sort of moderate Shia party. And he is not a loser, he's a winner. So he deserves to be part of the winning alliance. If those three alliances are the winners, then he should also be, these other four groups and parties should be the losers. And Muqtada does not want to accept Maliki in his grand coalition. for personal reasons, for concerns about his own sort of position in the state, historic reasons, so many other elements. But also he thinks this is the time now to press home his advantage. If now he agrees to consensus, then what is the value of the 73 plus seats that he's picked up? If he has to then agree to a consensus PM and hand out, cabinet posts to people that he has blood feuds with. He has a problem with Qais al-Khazali's Asahab al-Haq. He has a problem with Nouri Maliki's state of law. He has, several other ongoing issues with other groups. Why should he defer to them and allow them to be part of, the government if he has sort of beaten them convincingly in the elections? That's his personal view. And of course, you can imagine the other parties are very much concerned that if they allow him to run a majority government, and if he then holds, all the keys to power, what he might do in not in revenge, but what he might do in terms of reforms, what he calls al-islah, what it might actually be is an attempt to marginalize all these other groups. And so I think it's these two elements: his call for a majority government that excludes certain elements, which does not seem to be based on any specific agenda, just that he's friends with Amari, great, he's on board. I don't like Maliki, he's not on board. That formula is not acceptable to these other groups. And the second is the view of, like I said, the KDP to the PUK, the view of state of law to the other two parties, Muqtasa's view towards Fatah, is that we're the winners, they're the losers, therefore we should, be the ones to form a government. But, the complications around the federal Supreme Court's rulings on the majority needed, and the other rulings that have come up recently means that you have 220 seats essentially required to now form a government rather than 166. And 220 seats is very difficult to come by. You will need an element of Fatah, you will need an element from the PUK and others. And so now that's why, as Ambassador Estabadi also said, we are much more likely to have a consensus compromise rather than a majority government.
Dr. Marcin, I'm interested in your take on what was said and from the beginning and the contributions of Dr. Faisal and Dr. Sajjad. My question also, I would like you to come to mention another thing, that's the catalyst that used to help us when there was a gridlock or whether the dispute gets to a point where it's about to break. The catalyst used to be Najaf and the Marja'iyya. And I know that you are very close in your field of research to this dynamic. And the Marja'iyya has been absolutely silent. It made its position from the beginning that is not going to interfere, at least not overtly. But in the past, politicians or their delegates used to go to Najaf, and there was one door to knock at, which is the door in Souq al-Huwaish and Sayyid Sistani's place also. We are looking at now, it's a completely different story. There is another door that opened in Najaf, that's in Hannana. So the visits to Najaf are increasing, but it is taking a different stop rather than the traditional stop. Are we going to see something or some move from the traditional Najaf weight, or are we going to see this time Najaf taking a different participation and a different influence on the government formation, in addition to what you are going to say about the original debate?
Really great question. I think it's on everyone's mind. If you don't mind, I'm just going to very quickly make two comments on our first discussion and
Please.
Then jump very quickly into the issue of the Marja'iyya. I was just thinking when Sajjad was speaking about how alliances are formed and what we know from research about how alliances are formed. And it strikes me that the Sadr Maliki lack of alliance formation is something that really goes against a lot of what we know from the literature, where ideology doesn't matter for much when groups form alliances. It usually is about gains. And it's surprising that these two have continued to push with ideology. And I'm wondering at what point this will break. And by ideology, I mean a very, very general definition that includes what Sajjad referred to as their blood feuds, or how they feel about things. Because we see in other aspects of Iraqi politics, people who get along in one instance and who were enemies in the past. So this isn't something that is unfamiliar to Iraq. So this is a relationship that is really interesting to follow. And I do think it's because Maliki is some kind of monster in everyone's imagination, everyone's perception. And he just occupies this space that's very interesting and that really evokes reactions from the political class that have been interesting to follow. So I wonder how long they'll keep up, Muqtada will keep up his insistence on forming a government with an opposition rather than a consensus government across the board, given how difficult it is to do that. The other point I wanted to make, going back to talking about the new protest parties, and I'll say this very quickly, is I think everyone is, and by everyone, I mean everyone on the diplomatic side and on the international side, is focusing on the wrong definition of opposition. Everyone is focusing on the immediate gains of an opposition rather than fostering a long-term opposition. And what makes me really sad about this perception is and Sajjad mentioned this when he said that there is this perception that Muqtada might be America's pick because he's anti-Iranian, and the idea that that's how we're going to have a government and opposition, through pro and anti-Iran or pro and anti-America, whereas the true opposition that can be forming in government is the one that we see with the small handful of independents who aren't partisans and some of the new political parties. And they're being put in front of a test that if they fail at, it's going to have intense repercussions for Iraqis going forward. If they fail to convince the public that it's worth it to vote for them and it's worth it to vote for other protest parties in these next 4 years, then we're going to be stuck in a cycle truly of the same people winning over and over again with very little hope for change. And I think that's the culture of opposition we should be focusing on, not if Sadr and Maliki are going to ever make up or not, because at the end of the day, we shouldn't expect genuinely good governance out of either of them. And we've known this before, so I think it's a moot point to discuss it. Moving on from this to the Marja'iyya, my answer to Sistani's involvement or lack thereof is something that has to do with public opinion. The Iraqi public, I'm sure everyone has noticed for the last few years, has punished clerics. And clerics have mentioned this to me in nearly every interview. They've been punished for their association, whether directly or indirectly, with the Islamist parties. People have started to think of them as being responsible for it. And Sistani was the red line that was never really treaded upon directly. But I think they were worried that it would get there if we continued down this avenue. And so for the last few years, we've seen this slow retreat from politics in the direct intervention or in the mediatory role that we've seen in the past. And it makes sense because unlike the source of influence that Muqtada Sadr has, which is more populist, which is, more based on I'll say charisma in quotations, but it's charisma to a certain group of people. The Marja'iyya's influence is actually reliant upon, as you all know, a group of Iraqis that are the moderate Shia voter, not the ones who are Sadrists, and losing their support or losing their trust is something that has repercussions for the institution of the Marja'iyya, for the institution of the Hawza, that is simply not worth losing for them. So this is the right move. This is the move that they would have to do naturally as a result of the clear damage of the Islamist parties have wreaked on their reputation. Indirectly or directly, we can debate that, but I'll end here so that we have more time for questions.
Well, thank you. And again, please write your question if you have questions to the panel in the question and answer section of your Zoom screen. Let me go back to Ambassador Astarabadi, as I just mentioned earlier, on this constitutional timeline. The going wisdom among the decision makers is that the 30 days to elect the president is, as they call it, mudda tanzimi. It's an organizational period, not actually a mandatory period that they have to abide by and have a president by this. And the reason I'm asking are two reasons, and I want you to help me and our audience understand, since you are the constitutional expert here, and also on the ramifications of this. And with this scenario, once we pass the 30 days, there is no other deadline that the parliament will have to observe to have a president. And there is also nothing that is being built on that failure to rename a president or elect a president by the 30 days. And in this case, then it could really represent a flaw or a gap, a loophole in the Constitution. You can drive a presidential convoy through it. If a president has more than a third in the parliament supporting him, they can always break the quorum and have him be there, and he will get he could stay really all the 4 years for that matter, because we don't have anything to force them now to select a president. That means also we are not going to see a prime minister, and in that. Now the question is, in your opinion, and not just opinion, but in your deliberation, and from that period when the constitutional system was being put together, is it really an organizational period in the Constitution, not actually a deadline that is mandatory to have a president by? And if that is the case, and we cannot have a president, is the nomination of a prime minister candidate, the designation of that, supposed to happen after the election of the new president? Or can we envision a decision to be made that President Saleh can now choose a prime minister and designate him, and then they deal with the presidential election together? Is the Constitution mandating that sequence, or can we just deal with the issues that we can? Because if the president selects the prime minister after the elections, why not Barham Saleh? He's a president. Is there a constitutional barrier for that? And finally, in that, we already saw that the Supreme Court completely reinterpreted the Constitution on what happens in the first session, in terms of selecting the speaker, in terms of also registering the largest bloc in the parliament, which is completely now reinterpreted in a way completely different, 180 degrees different than what they've done in the past. Is there any basis for the Constitution to say that you can move on with business rather than have a possibility now of a government that will stay in power for the next 4 years, and a president who can stay in power for the next 4 years just because there is no quorum every time you want to elect a president? How do you sort of square this constitutional circle?
Well, I mean, to have a real opinion, I have to have a text. I can't just make it up. And the text is silent on every question you've asked me.
Hence my question.
And so we are through the looking glass. We are in Alice in Wonderland. There are no rules. And this is one of the flaws of the Constitution. The sequence is mandated in the Constitution. The Speaker, then the President, then the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister designates the Cabinet, and each member of the Council of Ministers, including the Prime Minister, has to win the confidence, the thiqa.
Yes.
And that's the sequence that's in the Constitution. I can tell you, when we wrote the transitional administrative laws, and we had a similar timing and similar sequencing, no, we didn't think this was organizational. 30 days meant 30 real days. Now, most parliaments in their legislative sessions have some procedure that the Americans call covering the clocks. That, well, we're supposed to be done by midnight tonight with this bit of legislation, but if it goes to 3 o'clock in the morning, that's okay. But that is not on the fundamentals of sort of government formation. And so here we're just in no person's land, and there are no real constitutional guideposts. Now, the court, I think, is probably an institution that most Iraqis have trusted. And in the Iraqi system and the continental system of law, having a court change its mind is not the disaster it would be in a common law system. It's a little more flexible. The rules of, there's no stare decisis, that the precedential value of prior decisions don't have the same weight in a European system that they do in the Anglo-American system. But the fear is that it begins to look like the court's just making it up as it goes along, and that becomes an institutional problem for the court. So we really are, I mean, on the one hand, the 30 days doesn't bother me greatly compared to the other constitutional lapses in that we have endured since 2005, 2006. But it is a problem because you're asking exactly the right question. Can Mustafa al-Kadhimi, can Barham Saleh, can the cabinet stay in power for another 4 years if no one is designated in their place? What happens? The answer seems to be no. But then does that mean we have no government at all? The answer to that surely must be no. And so we are in a no man's land. Allow me to make one very quick comment, if I may, about Dr. Marcin and her comment about the Marji'iyya and about the Marji'iyya's reputation being spoiled by the religious parties, or potentially spoiled, or put their reputation coming into disrepute because of the religious parties. Let me remind everyone, if I may, fundamentally, the constitutional system we have, including the putative custom, it's not in the constitution, the division of seats, or rather the division of positions based on ethnicity and confession is not in the constitution, as you said. But then it's not in the Lebanese constitution either. It is becoming the custom in Iraq. This is fundamentally the system we have in Iraq, the constitutional system, and the customary institutions that have arisen after it are fundamentally the system the Marji'iyya wanted. And I have always wondered, and I've been wondering for years, including at panels on the Atlantic Council, when will the Iraqis start to sort of hold the clerical establishment to account for the fact that the notion of consociational division of power was one very much advanced by the Marji'iyya and goes exactly against, it seems to me, the demands of the Tishreen protesters, who wanted sort of an Iraq, who were demanding their Iraqiness back. Nuridu Watan, we want a patrimony, is diametrically opposed to exactly the kind of thinking that Dr. Sajjad mentioned that the parties are going through. Well, the KDP, we wiped out the PUK, so we represent the Kurds. So-and-so wiped out the other Sunni, we represent the Sunnah, someone represents the Shia. No one seems to be speaking on behalf of Iraq. And no one is thinking in terms of Iraq's future, which is what the Tishreen demonstrators wanted, it seems to me. And this is the real disconnect. This is why you have somewhere around 30 to 40% turnout rates in the last election. This is a real danger if the population begins to disengage from the politics of the country.
Dr. Marcin, would you like to comment?
Yes, sure. It's an excellent point you raise. And I think I'd like to point out that one of the issues here is that there really isn't clarity, particularly for the generation that led Tishreen, about the role of the Marji'iyya as far back as 2003. So keeping in mind that the average Iraqi was born, 2002, the perception of that time period is so muddled. So this knowledge that comes so easily to people who knew how the constitution was drafted and how, for example, Ayatollah Sistani pushed for it to be done quickly, and for all these initial steps that were taken with the Marji'iyya's explicit intervention that became more implicit over time. these youth don't really know this because they have no idea what happened back then. They didn't live through it. I think that's an essential fault of this. By fault, I mean like a fissure between the political class and between the public that doesn't get discussed as much as other fault lines do. This particular fault line, which is that everything in Iraq that is a very young system that we have right now, it seems more static and it seems more entrenched because the youth who have to deal with it every single day and who protested actually don't have a grasp of how it came about and what motivated it. And if you think about Sistani's early intervention, at the time it was largely motivated by the fact that he feared that, as with prior occupations, as with prior governments, the Shia would be immediately excluded if this took too long. And so the best way to account for this is to very quickly have these built-in mechanisms that would at least ensure a place. And a democratic system of this kind that gave the highest level of government to the group that he represents seemed the best way. I'm guessing from his opinion or from the incentives of being in that position of seeing the Hausa being under brutality for years, of seeing Shia have very little role in politics, would motivate that. And I think these incentive structures, what really happened in 2003, all of that is something that we never talk about. And we kind of deal with the system as though it's static and deserves an entire, not reform, but honestly, reassessment entirely is what people call for when it comes to something like muhasasa. But the roots of it come from a historic reason, and it's wrong to not address this with the public. But I'm very glad you mentioned this point. I think it's completely right, but they won't be held accountable for it because no one really knows what their role was in the early days. They only know that they have this association with the civist parties, and because their role is continuously renewed, they get to be the face of public dissatisfaction.
Thank you. It's really enlightening. Now let's, Sajjad, probably you are, Dr. Sajjad, you would like to also chime in on this particular part, but I would like you also to answer a question from Barbara Slavin. She is asking, do we know which of the likely PMs is acceptable to Iran? Is there a resolution of Iranian differences with Sayyid Muqtada Sadr? And probably I might add to add to the question, do we have really concrete apparent or likely PM candidates at this stage that we have no, even presidential candidates settled? But feel free to comment on what was said earlier, but this question also, I think, is highly important, but also it is within your lane.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I will answer that question first. I don't think the Iranians have a veto per se on a PM candidate. I don't think they're in that position, nor do they want to be, frankly. I think they're much more interested in being the powers that broker an agreement between the parties, the ones that helped the Iraqi government form as a whole. I don't think they're sort of right now really worried about who is going to become PM, and if we don't have a say in choosing him, then he will then be against us. I don't think that's their concern. That they have much more strategic interests in how the government is formed. I don't think any of the prime ministers is going to be overtly anti-Iran anyway, so there's nothing for them to worry about in that respect. PM candidates, it depends really. I think the onus is on Muqtada Sadr to deliver a candidate for prime minister. The KDP is still fighting the battle to have its candidate for president accepted. Halbusi obviously managed to get himself re-elected as speaker, and so has decided that post. And so now it's really up to Muqtada Sadr to provide a name that is either acceptable to the rest of the Shia parties or is certain to pick up enough votes to pass, to gain confidence. At the moment, he's been very careful not to propose any names. He's given hints that he may allow Kadhimi to remain in post, But that's a mirage that we've seen. That trick has been done before with others. So I'm not sure we can expect Kadhimi to retain his post. We're not sure if he may propose a sadri qah, a vehement sadrist, a proper sadrist. He says he wants to propose somebody like that, but he's much more likely to propose a compromise prime minister that he knows is going to follow his agenda, and he knows will not be opposed immediately by the other groups from Fatah and so on. And there is a number of those, slightly technocrats, maybe former ministers, maybe people who don't have a current position, who are going to be overtly politically vetoed by sort of any one group, who maybe in the mold of Mohammed Tawfiq Alawi in the past, somebody like that who has some experience and neither side has any real issue with. I think that's the most likely scenario. So on the earlier comments, I would just say that from a personal anecdote, I remember sitting with Ayatollah Sistani in 2004 in Najaf, and he talked about his vision was, this is before we had elections, after the protests calling for the constitution to be written by Iraqis in response to Bremer's stance at the time. And he mentioned the fact that he wanted to see sort of two coalitions, two powers, he called it. He said, similar to what happens in the US, you have sort of one party, one group wins power, and the other goes into opposition trying to challenge and check the performance and the power of the other group. And this group could be comprised of Sunni, Shias, Kurds, Arabs, non-Arabs, and same with the other group. They wouldn't all sort of be falling on one side or the other. It would be a mix of two powers. And the idea is that they would compete on policies. Now, that was his vision in 2004. What has happened afterwards is that we never got an opposition. We've always had everybody in power and some people trying to pretend to be their opposition when obviously they weren't opposition. And I think that's the biggest sort of problem that we've had, is that the US, Iran, and everybody else has sort of pushed for a consensus, pushed for more compromise. It's led to weak governments, but it's also led to a lack of practice with regards to opposition. We don't have a real opposition. We have parties who are afraid they will be left out, and then they may sort of be marginalized or persecuted by those in power, which is why everybody wants a seat at the table. So I don't think the Marja'iyah's position is that it wants consensus. I think they do want an opposition, but the idea they lack the sort of drive to try to push an opposition to happen, versus, for example, what the US and Iran want, which is much more consensual.
Thank you. Let me turn to another question by Francis Tamer. Francis is asking, the rise and appeal of ISIS in Iraq was a functionality of the Iraqi government's inability to solve even a modicum of economic and social problems, plus disenfranchisement. Is the prevailing current situation, political infighting, disenfranchisement, etc., resowing the seeds for ISIS to regenerate, which is prepared to play in the long term or in the long game? Anyone of the panel?
Start with this and see if anyone would like to add to it. I'd say that in Iraq's recent history, we've always had an issue of people being dissatisfied with the government, rightfully, for the lack of services, for, basically the list of demands that come up in every protest. And these tend to lend themselves to protests in Iraq. What happened with ISIS is something that is unlikely to happen again, given the experience of the communities who had to live under ISIS. So we're unlikely to see a resurgence of ISIS in the way that we saw in 2014 ever again. But that doesn't mean that we won't be seeing instances of violence where there are political vacuums, where there's fighting between different semi-state armed actors, and in different areas that are usually pockets of violence due to unresolved tensions and like. So I don't think we are seeing the full end of ISIS, but we won't ever go back to what happened in 2014. I do think the grievances are going to accumulate. I do think that what Ambassador Estravadi rightfully pointed out to be Iraq's biggest problem right now is a lack of financial management. And for me, what I see as the adjoining big problem to all of this is that there really is no sound economist that is respected in Iraq and listened to, whose vision for change is something that can be pushed. We have, the white paper that everyone was very happy to see, but the white paper alone can't really do much. It doesn't aspire to enact actual changes as much as propose to lay them out later on. So there is really a lack of economic knowledge and financial knowledge when it comes to a lot of people who are in power. And I'm just going to be very frank about this. Every time I speak to anyone in the, barring a few characters that I'm sure you can imagine, like Ali Alawi, obviously, most of the people I do speak with who are in the Iraqi government or who are aspiring to, whether from entrenched parties or whether from new parties, have a very low and poor understanding of how the economy works. And their ideas for reform and their ideas for fixing it are very primitive. And they're not ones that are going to hold up against the extreme stress that Iraq will face in the next few years. And the reality of the oil prices being high right now is probably worse for us because we know that it'll just translate into patronage rather than into any meaningful policy. And what we know from political science from years of research is that economic grievances are channeled in the best case scenario into protest movements and in the worst case scenario into civil war. And that's because armed actors are the best place to get employment for unemployed youth. And that's really what we should be worried about when we're worried about violence. It's economic problems that can engender violence much more than the political vacuums that might arise due to the government formation process or something like that. We have a much bigger problem in the lack of economic planning and the lack of economic vision that's exhibited by almost everyone. And I always think, Finance Minister Alawi has a very tough job, one that hopefully he'll stay in, but who knows?
Well, I agree. I think what Iraq needs is to move from the diagnosis attitude towards the economy to a government economic program that is solution-based and that is action-based planning, as you just said, and that's important. The white paper, which is an important document, actually, and it's a good accomplishment of this government, but reading in it already said, the purpose of it is to take Iraqi economy from the intensive care unit to the critical